All right, here we go. So welcome everyone. I'm Laura Mendelo for those I don't know, but as I said, it does feel like a little reunion. Thanks everybody for joining today, especially if you haven't been here in a long time. It's just great to see your names and faces. And once again, if you're able to turn your cameras on, always good to see faces. We appreciate that. So if you haven't been here before, we call this the CliffsNotes Book Club. And what I mean by that, and it's always a tongue twister for me to say, but what I mean by that is you do not have to have read any of the books to come to our book club. It is really for people who we say want to stay in the know. So if you want to just get the latest on a book in the leadership business space, then we have a facilitator each month that has read the book, sometimes only a couple months before, but guaranteed has read the book. And they will give you a recap or a Cliff Note version of the book. And so we really like to engage in discussion with everyone and, give you the highlights of the book. And then whatever tangents we go off on, that is perfectly fine. So oftentimes people come to this book discussion and say, oh, that's a really good book. I want to go out and buy it. And they buy it afterwards. So whatever works for you and however much you want to share is just fine too. So I'm hosting it as part of Mendelo Consulting Group. We say when you get people, you get results. We look underneath the surface to understand what motivates people, what makes them tick, and we help teach leaders how to look at those clues and understand how people react and think and interact together so they can get great results. And we also say we develop leaders at work and beyond. So we look at leadership in all domains, at work, at home, in the community. We believe that you show up as a leader to life. We do leadership training, leadership development, and leadership coaching. All right, so let's go ahead and share the agenda for today. So we are so excited to have Dr. Barry Johnson here with us, and Barry will do his own introduction, but I'll just say I spent 2 years with Barry through the mastery program for polarity thinking and just fell in love with the program, with Barry. He is just a wealth of information and also has such a great perspective. He's one of those people who really can heal the world. And so we are just so excited to have him here today and talk about his book and also just hear some of his perspective and background as well of how he got started.
So welcome everyone, and thanks a lot, Laura, for inviting me to share the book with you and a little introduction to polarity thinking. And the focus is going to be on the book on the left. It's volume 1 of Making a Difference by Leveraging Polarity, Paradox, or Dilemma. But I also want to make sure that I pay attention to the fact that there is a volume 2, and volume 2 is full of contributions by people, including Laura, who've written chapters about their individual application from their expertise, their experience. And so it's wonderful to have both of those volumes available, but I'll be focusing primarily on the content of volume 1 and a quick summary about polarity thinking. So the first thing that I'd like to do is just share a brief history of quite brief history about the evolution of to the book And. So I was from age 13 to 26, I thought I was going to be a Lutheran minister. And so that was my intent in those early years. When I graduated from college in 1965, it was at that point in time in my own exploration of my theology and stuff that I came to the awareness or the belief, whatever you might call it, that everyone belongs. In traditional terms, it would be everyone is saved. And this universalism that struck me was so overwhelming and exciting that I just had to sit down and write a short book about this. I read the whole New Testament looking for indicators that might be true, and they were really obvious throughout once I had that awareness. So I wrote this book called All in 1965, didn't publish it, and I went off to seminary. As a part of going to seminary, Union Theological Seminary in New York City, I was involved in what was called a secular internship, where I lived in East Harlem and was a part of a study group that was studying studying what the life was like for people in low-income neighborhoods in the United States. And we were sitting in on all sorts of things that were happening in the community, living in the community and working in the community. And I got involved heavily in civil rights and in the peace movement, and ended up working as the office manager for clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam. The young men I was playing football with in the schoolyard on 106th Street between 1st and 2nd in Manhattan they were being drafted to go to a war that, as I was studying it, I found that I opposed the war significantly. A friend of mine actually supported the war, went and died in Vietnam. So I was really caught with this tension around the war. It was in that context that I got a chance to work with Dr. King, not on the civil rights side, but on the peace side, because I was behind the scenes supporting Dr. King's coming out speech, where at Riverside Church, he came out opposing the war in Vietnam. He did that as a member, not of Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but as a member of the board of clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam, where I was the office manager. So I was involved in a lot of protests, a lot of marches from that 1965 to 1970. I stayed living in East Harlem for those 5 years. Then I moved to Grand Rapids with my wife, Carol, and our 2 children in 1970. And so this next block of 5 years, what happened was Carol said to me, you've been supposedly at seminary for 5 years now. Normally seminary takes 3 years. So I'm wondering how far you have gotten in your seminary. And I checked, and I only had 1 year's worth of credits after 5 years of supposing to be at seminary, because I kept dropping out to be involved in some kind of protest movement or march or organization to deal with issues that I thought were just needed to be responded to. And so at 19, when I talked over this with Carol, she said, well, maybe your ministry is more about what you've been doing the last 5 years than what you think you're going to do after you leave seminary. And I thought, that's a great point. And so I thought, actually, if I look out into the future, I don't want to just continue to do protest work. Protesting is fine, it's essential, but I wanted to try to figure out and understand better how we could create systems that work well for everybody, rather than just protest the fact that they don't and when they don't. And so that got me into a process over those 5 years of wanting to become the best change agent I could. And I wanted to start with myself and my own development, and then look at larger and larger systems. So I got 2 years of training at the Gestalt Institute at Cleveland as a part of that process from 73 to 75. And it was in 1975 that the first polarity map emerged. It emerged when I was working with an individual client, and we moved physically around our 2 chairs in that process, which became a polarity map. And I realized that it was a wonderful manifestation of the whole notion of paradoxical change from Gestalt. And that set me on a course from 75 to the present. And so this ended up with me writing a couple of books. I wrote one in 92 called Polarity Management. Then I wrote one about polarities in congregations. And then Volume 1 in 2020, and Volume 2 in 2021, which was actually Laura and other people writing that book, but that combination came out recently. And so what happened is the book that never got published, called All, led to a book called And 55 Years Later. So that's my history, and there's a definite connection between Everyone Belonging and the book And. So that's the history. And what I'd like to do now is just quickly get into a little bit about polarities by having you experience together chapter 5 in And Volume 1. And this story is a way to just sort of cover polarities and resistance to change, and a number of things will happen just within this story. So this is the context. I'd like you to imagine that you're on a phone call with a US-based multinational company. The company's located in 46 countries. You'd recognize the name if I shared it. On the call are 3 people: Chief Operating Officer for the company, the Chief Information Officer, and the design team leader. They have a design team that is preparing to have a 4-day leadership gathering, bringing in leaders from all 46 countries. And there's about 200 to 250 people that are going to show up for a 4-day conference. And it's about leadership development. And they want to just acknowledge and recognize all of these people around the world who are working for this company. And so they have given a half a day to focus on polarity thinking. They've heard of my work. I've done a little bit of work with them, and they said, Barry, we'd like you to be involved in this. So we're having the call. And so this focuses on this 4-day leadership development for these leaders. And on the call, real early on, the call is like a few months in advance, and they're just trying to, make sure that what I do fits in with the other resources they're bringing in and the whole process. So the first thing they say is they wanted me to know the theme. They said, the theme is leading through values. And my response is, oh, that is just terrific. Because from a polarity perspective, values show up often in pairs. And the 2 values can be the 2 upsides of a polarity map. And how you manage that natural tension between 2 sets of values is fundamental to polarity thinking and to leadership. So this is going to be great that that's the theme. And my response I got from the Chief Operating Officer said, wait a minute, are you telling us that values come in pairs? And I said, I think they often do. So if I'm working with an organization and they are just starting and they're creating their values, their mission, their values, et cetera, I encourage them to think about the values in pairs and to articulate them that way. If they already have a list of values, then I look with them at the values and we see if there might be one value and its interdependent pair also shows up on the list. So for example, if we use a simple metaphor of inhaling and exhaling, if they had inhaling as a value, I would be looking on the list for something like exhaling, not because I've got anything against inhaling, but I know that inhaling without exhaling is not sustainable. So my desire is to just, enhance, give them a competitive advantage by looking at their values with them. And they responded immediately. They said, wait a minute, if you're going to be messing with our values in front of our top, 200 people, I want to know what you're going to do with them. So I want to send you the values right now. So that's the next step in this phone call. So they sent me their values, and I'm looking at their values. And so here's a polarity map, and this is the framework in my mind that I'm listening to what they're saying about their values. So this polarity map contains one of their values, which is autonomous business units that they articulate. It shows up on their list. So I'm looking for what might be an interdependent pair that if you're focusing on a lot of autonomy for your business units, which makes a lot of sense if you're located in 46 countries, what would be that interdependent pair? And if we could identify both of those, it would support them in gaining a competitive advantage by leveraging these 2 well and moving towards a competitive advantage or a more effective organization. If they don't see that interdependent pair, they're vulnerable to over-focus on this to the neglect of what that other value might be, which would undermine their ability to compete. So they go from a thriving organization to one that's struggling. So in a polarity map, the other thing I want to point out is there's this natural infinity loop energy system that flows to them. You get the benefits of autonomy and you experience the limits of autonomy that drives you towards the benefits of this other pole, which has its own limits. And this natural oscillation is the life cycle, an ongoing life cycle of any polarity. So they had autonomous business units. Now, I'd like you to join me. If you wanted to help them thrive or give them a competitive advantage, one thing that you could do is pay attention to what might be an equally important value to autonomy of the business units what would you be looking for? And I want you in 5 seconds in the chat room, I'd like you to just put what kind of, I'm not looking for one right answer. I'm looking for a general orientation or a general dimension that they need to pay attention to make sure that they weren't in trouble from over-focusing on autonomous business units. They need autonomy and they need what?
So we have collaboration between business units, another collaboration, interdependence, centralized systems, centralization, partnership or collaboration, centralized.
Absolutely great. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so notice how quickly, by the way, you can coming at this. Giving you 5 seconds is plenty of time. Now, this is worth millions of dollars actually a month to this organization. And you're just using your life experience and just the simple question, what might be an interdependency, which is a polarity question. And you came up with some version of this, centralized, integrated, coordinated, etc. So I'm looking at their list, and there's nothing like the list of words that you came up with, all of which would work as the other pole. So I point out, don't have anything like centralized coordination or integration. You don't have anything in that value. And they said, well, that's true. It's pretty obvious. There were only 6 values and none of them looked like that. And they said, so Barry, what do you make of that? I said, well, your organization is going to experience the negative results from over-focusing on autonomous business units to the neglect of something like integrated or centralized. And so what I said to them, your organization is experiencing or will experience the following dysfunctions. So again, another 5 seconds. What are they likely to experience if they over-focus on autonomous business units to the neglect of integrated business units? Go ahead.
All right. So we have inefficiency, lack of systems, disjointed, duplication, siloed, competing.
Yep. Exactly. You have hit you've hit all of those work. Now, so this cluster, I'm going to summarize it with just a few simple ones. It was a larger list, but for just the sake of this, I want to keep it kind of focused. So you mentioned silos of the business units, excess competition, and others said disjointed, everything that you said would work. So they're going to experience a cluster of dysfunctions. There's nothing wrong with having autonomous business units. They're absolutely essential. But if you focus on those to the neglect of the other pole, which isn't in their list, then you get these silos and excess competition. So what I said to them is you're going to experience these silos, isolation of the business units, and excess competition. And at some point, you're going to identify that as a problem. Now, when you do, you're going to bring your business unit heads together with your executive team, and you're going to agree that you need to solve this identified problem. Now, from a polarity perspective, what that solution will be actually will be the positive results from doing a good job of integrating those business units. It would be going from the downside of autonomous business units to the upside of integrated business units. So when they say they're going to solve this problem by going here, what will they be going after? Which is what would be the positive results if you did a good job of integrating those business units? What are they saying they're going to go after when they meet as a group? What shows up?
Efficiency, effectiveness, synergy, consistency and efficiency, flow, creativity, coordination, collaboration.
Exactly. Terrific. Again, everything you said works. So in simplified version, I'm talking about going from the problem of silos and isolation to integration of those business units, from excess competition to more towards collaboration and mutual support, coordination, and efficiency. Everything that you suggested all works. But I didn't stop there. I said, you're going to agree that that's where you're going to go, but then you're not going to go there. Now there's silence on the other end of the line, and I break the silence by saying hello, and the chief operating officer comes back in a quite angry voice, and he said, "Who have you been talking to?" And I said, I haven't been talking to anybody. This is just how polarities work and how values work. And so it's really quite predictable that you'd have trouble making this move. And he said, well, are you telling me that you knew that we aren't going to walk our talk? And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, I want to know how you knew that, because 2 years ago, I held that meeting you described. And we agreed to the person. All 46 business unit heads and our executive team agreed that we needed to go from silos and excess competition towards integration and collaboration. And we have hardly moved an inch in 2 years. And I want to know how you knew that. And I said, well, that's why I'm coming to spend a half a day with you. But what I knew was a couple of things that was from a polarity perspective. You have the downside of one pole, the natural self-correction for which is always the upside of the other pole. That's the benefit of being able to shift to get the benefit of this pole. But there's a wall that occurs if you see that as the whole picture, because and that wall will stop you from moving where you say you want to go, because your head wants to go there and the rationale is solid. But there's a couple things that are missing, and that is the two other dimensions of the polarity map, which is a historical value that caused you to have autonomous business units as a value in the first place, and then a fear of losing that value. And I was aware of this. And so let me just break from this for a second and talk about it from a theoretical base, and then we'll jump right back into you filling in these other quadrants. So what I was aware of is that they are likely to treat this as a problem issue in which they see it as an either or issue. Either we're going to have autonomous business units or we're going to have integrated business units. It's an unconscious bias for or thinking that we all get out of formal education and even informal education. So I assumed they had that in place. Other thing I assumed they would have in place is that they would use gap analysis for their change strategy. Gap analysis tends to be the basic elements for almost all change efforts. And it begins with a problem, or the present state, and seen in the limits or concerns about the present state, going to a solution, which would be how I respond to this present state, and then a strategy to bridge the gap between the problem and the solution. Now, all of these elements are important within a polarity map. You need to be aware of what this downside is, what this upside is, and you need a strategy to move that direction. But what's missing is the rest. And that's where the resistance will come from, and why I knew they weren't going to walk their talk. Because in fact, there also is a legitimate new problem that they would be afraid of if they actually approach this solution. And that problem would lead to them wanting to have an alternative solution. They're also using gap analysis. Notice they've got a problem they're worried about having, they've got a solution, and their strategy is to hold on to this present solution. And so now you have the tension between these two. Both of them are using or thinking. One is saying, are we going to do this solution, or are we going to hold on to our historical strength? And a lot of this is just unconscious. The blue is essentially an unconscious arrangement, or is an unconscious bias for everyone. So that's where the blockage will come from, or thinking, and this resistance that comes from this value and fear system, which blocks it. So let's get back to our story. So the next piece that would be a part of this is there's a value here, a value that in fact is why they have autonomous business units in their value system in the first place. This is a very powerful value in this organization. And so it's so powerful that they didn't even have anything like centralized or coordinated or integrated. They just had autonomous business units. Okay, now, so the question is, what would be all the positive results of doing a good job of allowing autonomy for your business units if you're located especially in 46 countries? What's the benefits of having autonomy in your business units when you're an international company? Go ahead.
All right. So diversity, sense of ownership, entrepreneurship, speed, creativity, adaptability, nimble.
Absolutely. Great. They all work. Now, notice that list that you got, again, in 5 seconds. This list is available when you ask the question. But if you're using gap analysis combined with or thinking, you don't ask the question. You think you've got enough with a problem definition, a solution, and a strategy to bridge it. But what you need is to be aware of this value system: entrepreneurial initiative, speed and responsiveness, the very things you came up with. Now, if you value entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness at 99 on 100 scale, you'll be afraid of losing it at 99 on 100 scale. So what would they be afraid of at the gut level where their head says we need to go towards integration and collaboration? What would they be afraid of if they over-focused on integrated business units to the neglect of autonomous business units? The fear would be of losing this. What would the loss of this look like? 5 seconds, go.
The loss of power adds too much time for decision making, unclear accountability, impractical bureaucracy, a slow, unresponsive.
Exactly. Wonderful. Bureaucracy and red tape, slow and unresponsive. Now, again, so I'd like to point out what's happened here. I didn't know
the slides in advance. I just need to say I wasn't just pulling out the comments that aligned. This is good. Yeah.
Okay, so notice what's happened here. This is a very large, actually Fortune 20 company in the world. They were struggling for 2 years trying to move from here to here, and it was triggered by a very powerful value. It had all these upsides and a fear of the losing of that value, fear of bureaucracy and red tape. It was the fear of losing this and wanting to hold on to this that led to that resistance, the resistance to move here. And so this is how powerful it can become. And we don't have to blame anybody here. The problem was they misdiagnosed the situation they were in. They saw it as a problem with a solution, and as all they had to do is provide a strategy to get it. But if they saw it as a polarity to leverage, they'd be aware, oh, there's 2 upsides here, and there's 2 downsides. And the objective is not just to get here, but the objective is to get both upsides. So what happened, and that will give them a competitive advantage or help them thrive. So when we met 200 plus people at their corporate headquarters, what we did was we broke into table groups of 6 people each, and they all had the same polarity. And they decided to call the greater purpose a thriving business. And they had autonomous business units and integrated business units as the 2 poles. And then they had declining business here as their deeper fear. And every table group was asked to fill out response to these questions. What would be the positive results of having autonomous business units? Because this was all blank for them. So all these tables did the same as a table group. They generated what are all the upsides of autonomous business units? What are all the upsides for integrated business units? And what would happen if we overfocused on autonomy to the neglect of integration, or integration to the neglect of autonomy? They generated all these maps together. And of course, they had redundancy, just like the redundancy that you showed in terms of what we had in advance and what they all came up with, and what you came up with in a total of 25 seconds. To do the whole map plus 1 poll. So what did we do after that? What we did after that was, since we were aware that their general desire was to move from this over-focus on autonomous business units to here, paradoxically, what we do is we first identify action steps. What are we doing or can we do to make sure we hold on to our entrepreneurial initiative and our speed and responsiveness? After they were assured we are going to hold on to all these things, that reduces the fear of getting caught in this downside. So first we affirm the upside of the pole you're moving from. Then we identify what action steps are we also going to do to make sure we get our integration and collaboration. So then we looked at, okay, also we are aware that this over-focus on integrated business units could lead to bureaucracy and being slow and unresponsiveness. So what would be early warnings that would let us know that we get there so that we can self-correct as necessary? And then what are the early warnings that would let us know that we're getting into this downside so we can correct as necessary? And so we did that in an afternoon, generating all the maps, all the content, and then they put all of this together, which significantly supported them in moving ahead in leveraging this polarity, which they will be leveraging, by the way, as long as the organization exists. So in quick summary, every change effort is part of an infinity loop energy system, and polarity energy is at play. Having all the power and all the alignment in a change effort is not enough to overcome the misdiagnosis of treating a polarity as if it is a problem to solve. If you want to guarantee the failure of a change effort, just tie it to 1 pole of a polarity. It doesn't matter which pole. If you want success in a change effort, tie it to both poles of a polarity, because that polarity will always be available to leverage because polarities are indestructible. I want to just drop down to what we call our small process. It involves first seeing, and I'd like to just, I guess this is something I would like to share with you. So we have what we call a small process for leveraging polarities. And the first is seeing. And there's a couple of dimensions to seeing. One is that one of my mentors, Jack Gibb, said that if we can see ourselves, another person, an organization, or a nation completely, love is a natural result. So there's one dimension of seeing that a polarity lens can help us enhance our capacity to love, because we can see ourselves and others more completely. And when we do, love is a natural result. So that's one dimension of seeing. Another dimension is just seeing the two poles of a polarity. Once you've seen it, then you can map it. You can ask, well, what would the upsides and downsides be? Once you've mapped it, you can assess to what degree are we maximizing both upsides and minimizing the downsides. And then you can learn from that assessment, and then you can leverage it by having action steps to maximize both upsides and paying attention to early warnings for the downsides. And so I'd like to share with you, the other thing is that we engage key stakeholders every step of the way. So in this simple process, I'd like to share, this is from chapter 23 in And Volume 1. And it's a story about Dave Wenegren, who, when I met him, he was the Chief Information Officer for the Navy. And I was presenting polarity thinking to a group of senior naval officers at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And I had dinner with him and some others the night before my presentation. He was there for the day before and was leaving that night. And so I had dinner with him and some other officers, and at the table conversation, he learned about polarity thinking, and he said, Barry, I think this is terrific. I'm not going to be around tomorrow to learn any more about this, but might I call you sometime in the future? And I said, yes, sir. So a couple months later, he gives me a call. And at this point, he had moved to become the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the whole Department of Defense. Now, what did he do? In this case, he started by seeing. And he said to me, he said, Barry, I've got this new job. And as I'm just going about listening, primarily listening here at the Pentagon to all the conversations that are going on in the information side of an information coordination for the Pentagon, he said there are two groups that are fighting with each other. One group is saying we have to have good information sharing. 911 was in part a function of our not having good information sharing. We can't serve and protect if we don't have good information sharing. Another group is saying we need to have information security. If we don't have information security, the enemy will contaminate our information, or they will get information from us that we don't want them to have. We have to have good information security. He said, Barry, these two groups are trying to protect our country from each other. So, so he said, he laughed and he said, is this one of those polarity things we talked about at dinner? And I said, I think so, sir. So Barry Frew, who's a retired naval officer who ran the Naval Postgraduate School, he and I went to the Pentagon and met with Dave Wenegren and his executive staff. He invited us to come in and meet with them. So what we did was we had a huge screen in the front of the room. There are about 14 people in the room. I briefly shared polarity thinking, and then I asked them the question. This is a small sample of what we actually did, but we generated the map on the screen together. And we had a staff member was populating the map. What we had to start off with was information sharing and information security. That was all we had. Then we built the map, and then we decided what the greater purpose and deeper fear might be. It ended up being information advantage and irrelevance and insecurity. Now, again, the wisdom was in the room. All I did was ask them the question, in your efforts to do a good job of information sharing, what would be the positive results if you did a good job of information sharing? And they came up with innovation, creativity, agility, increased national security awareness. And then I asked, well, what would be, if you did a good job of information security, what would you get? And they said, be protected, reduce loss, more costly for attacker, increased national security protection, et cetera. Then I asked them, what would happen if, what would you if you overfocused on information sharing for all these good reasons, but you did it to the neglect of information security and thus lost all of these things. And they came up with vulnerable, identity theft, loss of competitive advantage, and information overload. And then I asked them the same question. If you focused on information security to the neglect of information sharing and lost all of this, what would it look like? And they've got stifles creativity, inflexibility, negative workforce attraction, and creating stovepipes. So we got that far. Now we've done the seeing and the mapping. So we're going to assess it. So in our assessment, we're asking them how frequently they're experiencing each of these quadrants. And notice it goes from almost never, seldom, sometimes, often to almost always. And notice the infinity loop. Ideally, we'd want the assessment to indicate that they're almost always getting this upside and almost always getting this downside and almost never getting in the two downsides. That's why the infinity loop looks like it is. So that's what we're shooting for. So as Laura was talking about, I asked them the question. I said just for curiosity, because we didn't have this formal assessment. We just did an informal assessment with a group. I said, look, I'd like to just do a quick assessment of where you are right now. And I said, one possibility is that the power in this system is such that most of the power was with information security. If that were true, you're likely to be vulnerable to overfocus on that and get in this downside. And it would look like that. Another possibility is that there's more power within the Pentagon right now within the information sharing part of the community, and it would look like this. And they said, well, actually, Barry, it looks like this. And so we talked about that and how that could come about. And then we got into the next process, which was we looked at what are they doing or could they do to maximize the upside of this pole? And then what are they doing or could they be doing to maximize the upside of this pole? And then we looked at early warnings. How would they know early they're getting into this downside? And how would they know early they're getting into this downside? And thankfully, David gave me permission to share this. But that was that's how this process works. That was done in about a half a day. I think we got there at noon, and we had a half a day, and we did all of this in a half a day with that executive team. And then they went out and shared this, and they shared it to the whole information community about, look, it's not going to serve us well. We're not serving and protecting if we're going to fight over information sharing or information security. We need to do both. We're going to monitor how we're doing both. And that was done at the Pentagon when Dave Wennergan was there, and he used it as a centerpiece for his work there. So let me stop sharing again to get back to our discussion. But yeah.
Oh, actually, if you could share that one more time, there's I think an important piece there that is helpful for people to understand when you're looking at action steps. You have marketing on both sides, right? So there's sometimes one action that you take that would leverage both upsides of both poles. But what I'm seeing in the fine print here is understand why information sharing on the one side is valued, and the other side is marketing to understand why information security is valued. So by individually going out and marketing it, you can see how that would have a negative effect. And so understanding those coordinated efforts of, in this case, marketing the value of both. Mm-hmm. So somebody from who is, let's just say, on the information security side, they're not going to just market information security and explain the value. They need to also, out of their mouths, show the value of information sharing. And that's where you start seeing, like, if there were two teams, I'm just thinking marketing and, marketing and let's say implementation team, right? Because they're always at odds. Yeah. And so if you get the two teams actually appreciating the value, both sides from the beginning, then they're going to do the action planning in a unified way. So I just wanted to share that a little bit, just because we didn't really, obviously we don't have time to go through much, but I think that's an important part, that it's not just the left side goes out and does their action steps, and then the right side goes out and does their action steps.
Right. That's a great point, Laura. And it's always, when you're working with implementing a polarity, it's always a dual strategy. And so as you think of marketing, as Laura said, what would be the marketing dimension to the strategy around information sharing? Well, it would be understanding the imperative to share. How would marketing relate to understanding the value of security? So you're always thinking in a dual strategy. How would this support it, and how would this support it? That becomes, and you're starting to think in both and terms. That's why the and is so important. Marketing for information sharing, marketing for information security. Let's make sure we do both. And one triggers the other. So when the question comes, how would we do good marketing here? It raises the question, well, but how would we do good marketing here as well? And I should say.
Last question to you is, what do you hope the polarity thinking will do for us and our society moving forward?
Well, the powerful thing that I've experienced since the 75, when the first polarity map appeared, is that and it's gotten clearer and clearer over time, over the last 55 years, it's gotten clearer and clearer that or thinking without and thinking is a root cause and perpetuator of poverty, racism, and sexism. And it's a way to explain how we can have such evil results, such evil conflict and abuse in our society without having to identify some group or individual as inherently evil. There is no evil source. The source of our dysfunction is in part the fact that we see everything as a problem to solve, and we treat everything as an either or proposition when it's not. And so the effort to respond to poverty, racism, and sexism, that will not be addressed effectively by the same either or thinking that caused it in the first place. And so we need to, in our efforts to address poverty, racism, and sexism, we need to make explicit that we need to look at how we address this from a both and perspective. What are the key underlying polarities that need to be leveraged well to effectively address poverty, racism, and sexism? And that's what I try to summarize in chapter 29. So you can see my best take on what might be some important polarities in that regard. But I think it's fundamental. All chronic issues that survive centuries, let alone decades, they're chronic because they're wrapped around a polarity that is inherently unavoidable and unsolvable. So we'll have it with us for the rest of time. But the possibility is that we can leverage it. We don't have to have all sorts of suffering around these chronic issues. We can minimize that suffering and use the inherent tension in a polarity to, in fact, leverage and make a place, an organization or a nation state or a human community or the whole environment that works for everyone. We can approach that much better than we have so far.